we're so happy to have you join us. So I just want to start by having you introduce yourself, talk about your publication, and any other background info you'd like to share.
Yeah, for sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I think that the Show Up for Justice campaign is so incredible, and I couldn't be more honored to be supporting it in whatever way I can. So, my name is Olivia Seltzer. I'm the 16-year-old founder of the Cramm, a daily news organization for Gen Zers. So we have all the power and tools we need to go out and change the world.
That's amazing. The fact that you founded this organization when you were 16, it just shows how the youth starting these organizations is so possible. And that's it's entirely what our campaign is about. So, as you mentioned, that it's a media publication. So, obviously, since you guys are reporting on different world issues, how do you decide on what specific issues you want to report on?
Yeah, I think there's definitely two parts to it. I think the first part really comes from wanting to make sure that our generation as informed as older generations so that we are able to have those conversations because obviously change can't just be made by only working with Gen Zers. We also have to go to the older generations who are the ones in power right now. And then I think the other part of it is making sure that I'm sort of supplementing because I feel like there is a lot in traditional media that well, to rephrase that, I think that um, if you look at traditional media, a lot of times the things that are on the front page aren't necessarily the things that our generation thinks should be on the front page. Or maybe there will be stories when you go and dig down and down and down that you're like, why isn't this on the front page of the news? Like I think that's a big thing about our generation is that we're very proactive about being like, hey, this is a really big problem. People need to be talking about this and people need to be taking action. So I really make sure in the cram to include those kinds of stories and also include ways that we can help.
Definitely, I think it's amazing that a lot of these sources have become so convoluted, and you guys have kind of taken the most important key details from those things and put them into one source. So it's amazing work that you guys have done. So I'd like to ask what your research process is like. Obviously, since you guys are reporting on so many different things and you're pulling from so many different sources, like explain to me how that kind of process works.
Yeah, so I write the cram every morning at 5 a.m. So I wake up first and then I basically go to every news source out there. I love New York Times, BBC, The Guardian, Washington Post. I read both CNN and Fox News to try to see, the
Yeah, the
conflict.
different perspectives.
Exactly. Reuters, Politico, literally like every news source to try to get a very like objective global sense of what's going on in the world. And from there, I just kind of pull about like 15 headlines that I think just really stand out. And then I'll go back and read all of those like more in depth. And I don't just read from one article, I make sure to read from multiple different articles, again, to kind of get a less biased version of the news. And then from there, I make like the final like decisions on which stories to actually go ahead and include in the newsletter. And since it is such a condensed newsletter, sometimes I do have to make those challenging decisions, but I try to really give the biggest sense of what's happening in the world that I can.
And earlier you mentioned how you try to avoid like having a biased perspective. So how do you determine the credibility of the source? Because I know you touched on CNN versus Fox. So
Yeah, I think really for me it came from reading a lot of different news and understanding like and just coming into my own understanding of like what I see as biased. Or I mean that sounds like I'm having biases about what's biased, but it's more like I used to think that bias would just be like you would read an article and the journalist would be like, "Hey, I don't like so and so." And I'd be like, "Oh, that's bias, clearly." But now I realize that actually the more important bias when it comes from news outlet to news outlet is actually the kinds of stories that they're including. So, for example, if you go to CNN, there are typically a lot of stories really picking apart the different things that Trump does, which, of course, it's important to hold people accountable. But I also think that um, there are a lot of things that happen all around the world so that we need to be paying
yeah,
attention to as well. And I think if you go to Fox News, there are a lot of things picking apart, like Nancy Pelosi, for
yeah,
example, or now Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. So I think it's like, I think if I see one of those stories and I look it up and I don't see it published on any other news outlet, I'm like, okay, well, that's sort of that's a clear bias there because clearly it's not big enough of a story to make it everywhere. It just is more meant to paint this certain person or organization in a bad light.
Yeah, completely. And I'd also like to ask how, like maybe you as a writer or like person that's owning this kind of publication avoids having your own bias come into these things, because obviously it's a natural human thing. You think something about something and you want to publish that thing, correct?
Exactly, and it totally is something that's tricky, and I think that when I started the Cram, I went into it being very committed to being unbiased. I have a lot of friends who have very different political beliefs than me. I mean, we all believe in the same fundamental human rights. That's like that's a non-starter if you don't believe in that. But I have a lot of friends who don't believe in those things, or maybe they don't believe in them because of their parents, or not don't believe in human rights. But sorry, a lot of friends who have different political opinions from me, and a lot of times maybe it's because their parents have those different political opinions. And I think a lot of young people are just starting. We're kind of starting to figure out what we think about the world and what we think about these different policies and people. And I didn't want to create an organization that some people would read and feel very alienated and like, okay, there's no news for Gen Z. I found a news outlet for Gen Z, but it only appeals to a certain kind of Gen Zer because I
Yeah,
feel like it just doesn't really help very much. So I think I'm able to stay unbiased because I'm so committed to that idea. And I feel like if I was biased, that would do more harm than good.
definitely. And I think that's amazing that you're able to see that differentiation. So as you know, Justice in the Classroom has started the Canopy Lab campaign, which is basically encouraging students to start their own student-led movement of any sort. So what advice would you have to students that want to research a topic that they're passionate about?
I think the very first thing to do, I mean, other than Googling it, is to not just take it from a one news source, which is what I do every day when I read. I look at multiple different news sources, like we just mentioned. So I think that that's the most important thing because I think a lot of times, especially with, I think social media infographics are fantastic because
Mhm.
people get to be introduced to these new topics. But I think a lot of times they're seen as that's the whole story, and that's not necessarily true. So I think that if you hear about a topic or if you start researching a topic, make sure to read as many different sources as you possibly can, um, to just again give that more objective sense of the story, and also because details get missed so often, and I think a lot of stories it's important to know all those details.
Yeah, definitely. Actually, I wanted to ask you about infographics and stuff. Do you see that infographics are becoming maybe like a more prominent news source in today's world of social media? But just with how more, I guess, more prominent they are in like how people use them for their news sources and like displaying information.
Yeah, I mean, I I have very mixed feelings about infographics. I use infographics for the cram. Like we have those. I mean, actually, we stopped and now we have like tweet guides, but or threads. But we did use them for a while, and I think that it's again. I think that they're because of infographics and because of their ability to be so shared and to go viral, people are able to be introduced to topics that they might not have known about before. And I think that there's certain kinds of people who actively seek out the news and different things about politics, and there are people who don't. And I think that it's a really great way of reaching the people who don't. But I also think that we shouldn't put too much stake in them. I think that again, I see them as an introduction and just an introduction, and I think if it's something where you want to get a message across, that's amazing. But I also think that there should be kind of a bigger call to action of like, great, now you know that this thing is happening. Now continue learning about it so that we actually have the ability to to make change.
Definitely. Well, that's all that I wanted to ask. And if there's anything else that you'd like to add when it comes to advice for people that want to start their movements, you can go ahead and share. But other than that, that's all I wanted to ask.
Oh, amazing. I think the advice I would give is to pay attention to what Justice in the Classroom is doing because I think that the work you guys do is so, so amazing.
Thank you so much. And same for the cram. Go follow the cram on Instagram. Okay, I can stop.